Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged, a podcast by Aurora Energy Research. My name is Alexander Esser, and I'm the head of the Baltics and the Nordics at Aurora, based in Stockholm. And I'm very glad today to welcome my guest, who is the Executive Vice President for the Electricity System Operator at Svenska Kraftnät, which is the Swedish TSO. She's also the chairman of the board of eSett, a company providing balancing settlement services to participants of the Nordic electricity market. And prior to that, had several roles at the Nordic utility Fortum and the Swedish TSO Ellevio. And I'm very glad to now welcome Lowina Lundström to the podcast. Hi, Lowina.
Hi.
I mentioned now Fortum, I mentioned Ellevio, now you're at Svenska Kraftnät. What drew you to the power sector in the first place?
Well, actually, I had been working in the telco sector for several years, and I was part of the transformation from ticking the grid, as it was called, to offering services to customers instead. And the energy sector at that time, about 15 years ago, was comparable with where the telco sector was 10 years earlier. Therefore, I found it exciting to be a part of the energy transmission as a sector. But I stay in the power sector as it is the most important sector for the energy transition and welfare. And working here means that one really can make a difference for so many people as well as society as a whole.
That's very interesting, and Svenska Kraftnät is one of the most important players to push forward the transition in the energy sector in Sweden. And now, for the first part, I would like actually to talk about the role of Svenska Kraftnät and the priorities. In our pre-discussion, you mentioned that Svenska Kraftnät is an agency, which is, of course, quite different to other TSOs who might be state-owned or publicly listed. So what does it mean for your role, or for the role of Svenska Kraftnät to be an agency?
Well, there are actually many pros being an agency. We are not commercial driven, but driven by how we can serve the society in a cost-efficient and transparent way. Being an independent agency without specific EBIT demands on the short term, we have the right prerequisites. On the other hand, there are some restrictions regarding sharing data with other foreign companies like TSO is based on specific national laws for government and agencies. That causes challenges as data exchange between TSOs is an important part of our common responsibility.
Now that's very interesting. I think we should touch upon the cooperation between the different TSOs, and especially the Nordic TSOs in a bit. But maybe before that, still on the role, how do you think has the role changed in the last years, that during a time where the share of renewables has increased quite drastically in the system, and also the bottlenecks between the different price zones has occurred? So how's the role changed?
Well, the absolute largest change, referring back to transformation I mentioned in the beginning, is that we had a quite long period of maintenance. The system was in balance, production was plannable, the grid was developed, and plans could actually be in place for several years ahead. Now we are facing a power system with many challenges simultaneously, and especially the large structural change at the production side, in combination with an outer world with new demands beyond expectations. And there is a dramatically increased need for ancillary services, flexibility, increased environmental demands. We're also moving from a few large producers to many small producers. And above all, consumption and production are not going hand in hand anymore as it did before. So the margins we previously had to run the system has been shrinking. And with renewables in the system, power will be less predictable, even if hydro can fend off parts of it. And the rate of change is increasing, and at the same time, the degree of complexity is increasing in matters of societal importance. For Svenska Kraftnät, the change in additional is that we now are in the spotlight of the energy transition with high expectations. We are moving from a more or less unknown agency to a well-known agency, being in the media almost on a daily basis. And that also includes a cultural change for the organization.
Yeah, being in the media very frequently. I guess this was especially the case during the last year of the energy crisis, of very high power prices, very volatile power prices across the Nordics and especially in the south of Sweden. So how would you say has the last year, the energy crisis, also impacted your work and the shift in the political landscape? And here I'm referring, for example, to some form of protectionism that has occurred. I'm not sure how much this occurred in Sweden, but for example, I know the case about a interconnector between Norway and the UK that has been delayed or even rejected due to protectionism. So how does this political landscape impact you?
We can see that there are some more protectionist voices, both in the media and in some countries. However, we have proven through many years of collaboration between the TSOs and the good outcome that collaboration is the way ahead. For cooperation is especially important in these demanding times. Few, if even any country, can solve the challenges by itself. So new interconnectors are to create a better solution for all. Of course, for some small periods, this might seem to have negative effects on single countries, but the outcome serves the society in the EU as a whole, as well as it serves each and every single country. And we are increasing our collaboration with other TSOs in ENSO-E, the Nordic Fora. And we are actually, I am experienced more often a willingness to cooperate than the opposite.
Yeah, that's good to hear. And how does this cooperation actually look like? Can you elaborate on that, especially between the Nordic TSOs?
You know, the Nordic countries are connected in one synchronous area, and we have many projects and several common-owned companies. Just to name some few examples, we are creating a new Nordic balancing model, including automation to serve our control rooms. We have common 10 years grid development plans. We are building new interconnectors with Finland, for instance, as we speak. We have several common-owned companies like 50 for IT development and eSett, as you said, for settlement. But also we have several dialogues on all levels within the organizations in order to cooperate even more. And in fact, our control rooms are cooperating on a daily basis. One time we need help, and the other one we can give help. So we are really here to cooperate and serve the society together.
So you're growing more together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what would you say are the priorities of Svenska Kraftnät, or maybe also of this cooperation of the Nordic TSOs in the next 24 months?
Well, we have so many priorities. I don't know if we can call it priorities, but at least to fulfill the need of society to speed up electrification and decreasing congestions by reaching the goal we have set by 50% reduction of lead time for overhead lines and stations. And here we are working closely in several regional initiatives with other agencies, the county administrative boards, municipalities, DSOs, large consumers, etc. All together, both in the north of Sweden, on the west coast, in Stockholm, and even more, just in order to find faster and better solutions together. I hope that we, through these regional initiatives, also can remove the not in my backyard perspective that still is a challenge, both for the transmission grid as well as for the distribution grid. Another priority we have is that we create new markets for ancillary services. And in order to get the work done as well in the whole industry, we need skilled staff. So we also have difficulties to find the resources. But above all, as the top one priority we have always is balancing production and consumption in the electricity system 24/7 and handling disruptions immediately. And that's always the top priority. And by that also preparation to be able to run the system in 10, 15, 20 years ahead.
Maybe I want to pick out one of those examples that you mentioned, reducing 50% of the lead time for overhead lines. So I guess this is also very much connected to solving the grid bottlenecks within Sweden. So how do you deal with the NIMBY concerns towards overhead lines?
People like to have electricity, but not in my backyard. And that's a challenge we are facing on a daily basis in the society today. But we also think that the crisis made people aware of the importance of a electricity infrastructure and a good working system. So we're both working on the short term and the long term parallel. We need to have two thoughts in our head together. So monitoring the system around the clock at the same time, we also continue our focus on the long term by building new power lines to meet tomorrow's need for electricity and create also then new solutions for the market. So we need to continue explaining the need of long-term planning. We taking the expert role and describe what the power system needs in the long run. And one of the most exciting parts of our job is that our perspective is between 2 seconds for these FFRs, ancillary services, and 40, 50, maybe even 80 years ahead, and everything in between.
Mm. So then in a way, it's also probably good that you are so frequently in the media, so you have the forum to educate the public on what is required to solve the bottlenecks.
Exactly.
Are there any other topics that you want to bring up around those bottlenecks? I think in our pre-discussion we talked about becoming an enabler of flexible generation or flexible demand, which of course can help in solving the bottlenecks on site to just laying more cables. So what do you think about that?
We as a TSO always need to take the system perspective. Make sure to point out the needs, where and when we need and what, and collaborate about solutions. Because as experts, it's our task to guide investors to the right geographical areas. So we invest in our short and long-term market analysis, and there can be a very good ground for pointing out the need of flexible generation and demand. One factor is, of course, the power of the electricity price. Higher prices during a longer period can attract investors to invest in electricity production.
Interesting. I mean, so now we discussed the priorities, we discussed the overhead lines, we discussed the grid bottlenecks, but there's maybe one other priority which was very prominent in the earlier this year, and it's your proposal for capacity market implementation. Just also some background for the audience: the Nordics and Germany are probably the few large power markets in Europe that don't have a capacity market yet. It's an energy-only market. So what can you learn from other European countries like GB, like Poland, on how to introduce such a capacity market?
Well, we can always and should always learn from others. As you mentioned, both Italy, France, Poland, Belgium, and UK have capacity markets. But we need to keep in mind that different countries also have different conditions, which probably make it a bit challenging to do a direct comparison. We would rather look at different design elements, what lessons can be learned from that, and how it could be applied for Sweden. If we take Italy, for example, they have a geographically differentiated capacity market, which is something we foresee would be the case for Sweden as well. So looking more close at design choices and experiences from Italy in that perspective would be relevant. We also believe that financial incentives like reliability options to ensure availability of the contracted resources is the preferred model. The reliability options, however, open up for many questions concerning demand side resources in particular, but perhaps also for storage. Therefore, here there might be a need for more innovative solutions compared with the standard ones, which have been more geared towards the traditional thermal generation. And for what we have seen, we also believe that a centralized model is to be preferred over a decentralized model. While there are advantages of a decentralized model, it could, for instance, provide more flexibility in the contracting. We also see clear disadvantages. For instance, if the electricity retailer were the contracting parties, how would that work in a retail market as we have high degree of competition, customer switching, and many small retail companies? It's quite complicated. And also that Sweden has then several bidding zones. We have 4. So a decentralized model would also become more complicated in terms of allocating transmission capacity for the capacity market. And in Europe, it's actually only France who have opted for a decentralized model. And the evaluation from the TSO and the regulator there indicates that there are several problems with that link to both liquidity, the ability of the model to ensure sufficient investments, etc.
But you are actually in a quite good position that you can modularly choose what has worked well in other countries and choose some design options that apply to the Swedish system.
Exactly, this is a very good situation to be in, actually.
Okay. Of course, one unique feature of the Swedish power system is that it's almost decarbonized, especially in the north, but the emission intensity is probably one of the lowest across Europe. So how do you fit this together, that you want to incentivize more dispatchable firm capacity, but of course you don't want to introduce any fossil generation in the new fossil generation in Sweden. So how does this fit together?
We look at the wind and the solar's contribution to this security of supply. They both can cause problems, but they also can be contributors. In any case, these technologies will most likely continue to grow. So we need to find solutions to ensure that they contribute to system stability as well. We had, for instance, a pilot with wind parks on how they can contribute with FCR down, and the outcome is actually very positive for all parties. Then we have the converter-based technologies, have the potential of supporting system stability, and there's a lot of work ongoing, what's called grid forming. So yes, there are ways to have wind and solar contribute to security of supply and also the frequency stability. But in terms of resource adequacy and from a capacity perspective, of course, these technologies have some clear limitations still.
Mm-hmm. But will they in the end be something that there is for certain technologies like a minimum emission intensity to be pre-qualified for this market?
And the pre-qualification is also our task, and there we have to have real defined rules for what is acceptable in the system.
Okay. All right. Time is beating us. So I would say we cover one more topic and then we go to our section underrated, overrated. So the last topic I would like to cover with you is actually the Swedish power market a bit more in general. Do you think that Sweden will continue to be such a major exporter of electricity in the future?
Yeah, as we probably will have more and larger electricity needs within Sweden with larger consumers and the electrification of the industry, we might have less to export, which we also can see in our short-term market analysis. By 2027, we still have a surplus for export. It will likely be decreased from today's 28 to 6 terawatt hours by 2027. And the same goes actually for the whole of the Nordics. In 2027, we still expect to have export surplus, but decrease from 38 to 13 terawatt hours. But after 2027, if and when all investment plans for electrification of industry will kick in and no sustainable amount of production will increase in Sweden, we will be an importer of electricity again, as it was in the beginning of the century. In parallel with an increased demand on the consumer side, we also see that approximately 80 terawatt hours of production will have reached its technical end of life. It's a bit further ahead, it's about 2045, but then the overall need is then for new production around 300 terawatt hours. So to your question, do we plan for Sweden continuing to be a major exporter of electricity to the rest of Europe? It depends on how fast we can increase our production. Last year, as you know, we were the largest exporter in Europe, but now I read that France has taken the #1 position again.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in this question, how the scenario in 2050, 2060 will look like, you also play a large role. So I could imagine getting also the permits down, getting renewables faster connected incentivizes more wind and solar in Sweden, and therefore will lead to Sweden remain an exporter. But also it contributes to less bottlenecks, and maybe this also attracts then a bit less of this very large demand in the north of Sweden, where a lot of those investments, of course, consider that they remain in an area with very low prices in the future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In our long-term market analysis, we had actually 4 different scenarios. So Sweden has a long tradition of export, and we likely will start as well. But actually 2 different ways to choose. Either we export electricity, and the electrification of the industry will happen in other countries, or we export products based on green electricity. So two scenarios were pointing out that the refining of raw materials like iron ore will be outside of Sweden, and 2 scenarios actually with high consumption, that we assume that Sweden in high degree would be a country exporting climate neutral products instead.
All right, then let's maybe come to the last section of today, overrated or underrated? So I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask you a few concepts in the energy transition and ask you if you think they're overrated or underrated. And don't feel the pressure to elaborate on your responses, so they can be very brief. But I just want to see if you think it's an hype or the opposite. So my first concept is a pan-Nordic transmission system operator. Is that underrated or overrated?
I would say it's overrated. We have a very good collaboration today already, but we have national legislation as well to follow. And we have different markets still. So that's, I would say, overrated.
Yeah, and also, I mean, at the beginning we mentioned that you're an agency. It's probably hard to also fit this together.
It is.
Yeah. Then the second concept, more grids as the major enabler for more renewables. Underrated or overrated?
Oh, it is a really tricky one, I think. It's both over and underrated. We need more grid, definitely. But at the same time, only grid, just more cables is not the only solutions.
Yeah. Next one, battery electric storage systems. So BESS to provide grid stability. Overrated, underrated?
Absolutely underrated. We can also see for the 5 years ahead that the battery introduction will also have a good effect on the prices.
On the prices of the...
For the households.
Okay. So even on the wholesale market.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. And then with the other side, demand response, like load shifting to provide grid stabilities.
It's definitely underrated. And actually remember a meeting I had about 13 years ago when I worked at Fortum. We had a European consulting firm talking about demand response. And we just looked at them and said, we don't need that. There's no need at all. We have as much electricity as we need, and we can even export. And now we are here.
Yeah. And procuring many of your grid services from both demand response and batteries. Okay. Yeah, interesting. And now we're coming to an end. So, Lowina, thank you so much for today. I think it was very insightful, and we will definitely watch you delivering on those priorities in the next 2 years.
Good, thank you.
That was Alexander Esser, Aurora's Head of Baltic and Nordics, based in Stockholm, talking to Lowina Lundström, Executive Vice President for the electricity operator at Svenska Kraftnät. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.